By late 1967, the Vietnam War had become a mounting political crisis in the United States. Televised images of U.S. casualties and nightly protest marches, many led by students on college campuses, had eroded public support. President Lyndon B. Johnson, anxious both to protect his Great Society reforms and to prepare for the 1968 election, publicly insisted that "we are winning," even as his advisors quietly debated ways to reduce American combat involvement and begin handing responsibility to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. On the ground in South Vietnam, U.S. and South Vietnam Army forces continued large-scale search and destroy operations aimed at rooting out Viet Cong guerrillas. Despite superior firepower, artillery barrages, B-52 strikes, helicopter gunships, the mountain of enemy bodies counted by General William Westmoreland failed to break the insurgency. Rural pacification programs such as the Strategic Hamlet Initiative, intended to isolate villagers from Viet Cong influence, often backfired, alienating the very people whose hearts and minds the United States hoped to win. Across the demilitarized zone, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, faced its own standstill. The People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, and their Viet Cong allies had suffered heavy losses over successive offensives, but they remained entrenched in South Vietnamese border provinces and the Mekong Delta. By November 1967, the Politburo in Hanoi and General Von Nguyen Giap concluded that only a bold, nationwide uprising launched so suddenly it would overwhelm South Vietnamese defenses could shatter the stalemate and compel the United States to withdraw. They seized the Tet Lunar New Year ceasefire as their moment of maximum surprise. On the evening of January 30th, 1968, as U.S. and South Vietnam Army units stood down for the holiday, diversionary Viet Cong teams struck remote outposts in the Central Highlands. At dawn on January 31st, more than 80,000 North Vietnam Army and Viet Cong soldiers exploded into action, simultaneously hammering over 100 cities, towns, and military installations, from Saigon's U.S. Embassy and downtown districts to the ancient streets of Hue and the isolated Marine base at Khe Sanh. Their aim was twofold: to spark a popular uprising in the South and to shatter American confidence by proving the insurgents far stronger than the Johnson administration would admit. Indeed, Viet Cong sappers penetrated the outer walls of the U.S. Embassy compound, briefly breaching the chancery itself. Although Phase 1 remains the most celebrated, the campaign continued in successive waves. A second round of coordinated attacks on smaller provincial capitals began on May 4th and lasted into mid-June, and a third August offensive ran for 6 weeks starting on August 17th. In each case, U.S. and South Vietnam forces eventually reclaimed lost ground, but only after fierce, often house-to-house fighting that inflicted heavy military and civilian casualties. By early March, Saigon streets had been cleared. Hue was officially retaken on March 2nd after 26 days of bitter combat, and mop-up operations wound down by March 20th with communist losses exceeding 40,000 killed or captured. Yet the psychological impact proved even greater than the physical one. American television returned from Tet Offensive not with tales of triumph, but with images of a mighty effort stalled at the gates of Saigon, and Capitol Hill began to question the war's wisdom. On March 31st, President Johnson stunned the nation by announcing he would neither seek nor accept his party's nomination for a second term. In the aftermath, both sides claimed victory. U.S. and South Vietnam Army units have repelled the onslaught and restored control, while Hanoi had demonstrated its ability to dictate the terms of engagement and shake American public resolve. Within weeks, General Westmoreland was urging reinforcements for an accelerated pacification campaign, yet President Johnson curtailed bombing north of the 20th parallel, capped U.S. troop levels, and laid the groundwork for peace talks. Back home, anti-war protests swelled, cementing Tet Offensive as the turning point when Washington-Vietnam policy shifted from expansion to containment, and when North Vietnam, despite staggering losses, seized the strategic initiative. The fallout from the Tet Offensive reverberated far beyond the battlefields of South Vietnam. Domestically in the United States, It eroded public faith in official assurances of imminent victory. Network news repeatedly contrasted tallies of U.S. casualties with White House assurances of progress and shattered cityscapes with White House pronouncements of light at the end of the tunnel, fueling a surge in anti-war demonstrations and a fracturing of Johnson's credibility gap. Politically, Tet Offensive accelerated the shift toward Vietnamization, handing ever greater combat responsibility to South Vietnam Army units, and compelled the administration to open serious peace negotiations with Hanoi. In military terms, the offensive forced U.S. commanders to rethink conventional search and destroy tactics in favor of counterinsurgency and population security measures, while sowing doubts about the utility of large-scale B-52 strikes and mass firepower against an enemy adept at blending into civilian areas. Across the Pacific, allies in Europe and Asia questioned Washington's judgment and commitment, even as Moscow and Beijing quietly reassessed their own support levels, seeking to balance assistance with the risk of direct confrontation. Ultimately, Tet Offensive's greatest legacy was psychological. It demonstrated that strategic initiative, once seated, is hard to reclaim, turning what had been a war of attrition into a war of will and setting a new course that will culminate in American withdrawal and a reshaped Southeast Asian order. And that's how the Tet Offensive didn't just reshape the battle lines in Vietnam. It reshaped the debates in living rooms and the halls of power back in Washington. What began as a shock and awe campaign across scores of South Vietnamese cities ended up dealing the greatest blow to American public confidence, accelerating peace talks and setting the stage for U.S. withdrawal. Despite suffering staggering losses, Hanoi proved that moral and psychological momentum could be as powerful as any battlefield victory. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe for more military history breakdowns, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode on the legacy of Vietnam's final years. Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about Tet Offensive? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.